She wasn't the kind of woman anyone noticed when she walked into a room. That wasn't an accident. Elara Voss had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the art of being invisible. She wore dark colors. She kept her voice low. She sat at the corner of every meeting table and took notes that were so precise, so methodical, that the men who signed her paychecks had long since stopped trying to understand how she did what she did. They just knew that when Elara handed them a ledger, it was clean. When she said a number, it held. When she flagged something, quietly, in a folded note passed across a desk with no witnesses, it meant someone somewhere was about to have a very bad day. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most useful person in the building. No one ever told her that, of course. She was the kind of woman who got gift cards at Christmas, not bonuses. The kind whose name people forgot at parties, even if they'd worked with her for 3 years. The kind who ordered a salad at a business lunch, not because she wanted one, but because she'd learned, somewhere in her mid-20s, that ordering what she actually wanted made people look at her a certain way. A way that made her feel like something to be assessed rather than someone to be heard. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting. She kept a small jar of sea salt caramels in the left drawer of her desk, and she ate exactly 2 of them every afternoon at 3 o'clock, because it was the one indulgence she allowed herself without apologizing for it. And she had worked for Silvano Marte for 4 years without ever once letting him see that she knew exactly what he was. Most of the legitimate businesses in Montreal had accountants. Some of those accountants, the ones who asked too many questions or looked too closely at certain line items, didn't last long in their positions. Elara had survived because she understood the fundamental rule of working in the grey spaces of the world. You saw everything, and you showed them you saw nothing. She was exceptional at it. Silvano Marte, or Mr. Marte, as Elara had always called him, because she was careful about everything, including distance, was 42 years old, and he ran the kind of holding company that showed up correctly on every tax form and incorrectly on no surveillance record the city had ever managed to compile. He was not especially tall. He was not especially charming in the ways television had taught people to expect from men like him. He didn't make speeches. He didn't throw parties. He dressed well, in a way that said money without saying anything else. And he had dark eyes that moved across a room the way a camera does, steady, measuring, never blinking for too long. People were afraid of him. Elara was not afraid of him. She respected him, which she'd always thought was the smarter version of the same thing. She had been in his offices on Boulevard de Maisonneuve for 4 years. She had survived 2 audits, 1 attempted, hostile acquisition, and the quiet disappearance of a mid-level associate who had made the mistake of skimming from the wrong account. She had never asked about that last one. She had simply noted the gap in the records and corrected it, and left the folded note on his desk the way she always did, and come in the next morning, and made coffee, and opened her ledgers. She did not think about the fact that sometimes, when she sat across from him at the long conference table, going through the quarterly projections, Marte would stop reading mid-sentence and look at her for a moment too long. She did not think about the way he'd called her Elara instead of Ems. Voss, exactly once, almost 2 years ago, during a very stressful restructuring of the Laval property files, and then had never done it again. She did not think about these things because she was practical, and because she had made an agreement with herself a long time ago about what kind of life she was going to live. A quiet one, a safe one. One where the sea salt caramels were hers and hers alone, and no one looked at her in ways she'd have to decode later, lying awake in her apartment on Rue Jean Mance, wondering what they meant. So when her friend Petra, not a work Petra, an actual friend Petra, the kind who texted memes at midnight and remembered your bad anniversary dates, convinced her to go to dinner on a Thursday night, Elara said yes, mostly to make Petra stop asking. You need to go. Petra had said 3 separate times in 1 week. He's nice, Alara. Like, actually nice. He coaches youth hockey. He has a rescue dog named Biscotti. A dog named Biscotti is not a personality, Alara had said. He's a lawyer. He has good teeth. Also not a personality. He thinks you sound interesting. That one had landed differently. Not because it was particularly compelling, but because it was the word interesting and not the word pretty. And that distinction meant something to Alara, even if she didn't want it to. His name was Desmond. He was pleasant in all the ways Petra had described. He had an easy laugh, and he asked follow-up questions, and he didn't look at her the way she'd been looked at before. That sweep, that assessment, that particular brand of polite disappointment that some men didn't even realize they were showing. Desmond from Laval with the hockey kids and the dog named Biscotti looked at her like she was someone he was genuinely trying to figure out, and that was, she thought, probably the best she'd hoped for. They went to Rivière Noire. It was the kind of restaurant that Alara would never have chosen for herself. The lighting was amber and deliberate, low enough that you couldn't read the menu without leaning forward, which was, she suspected, entirely the point. The waitstaff moved like they'd been choreographed. The wine list was longer than her graduate thesis. She had worn a deep green dress, the one she'd bought 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding, and never worn since. She had almost put it back in the closet 3 times before leaving her apartment. But Petra had seen it on a video call while Alara was getting ready, and had said, "Don't you dare change," with such certainty that Alara had left it on out of sheer loyalty. She looked different. She knew that. She wasn't performing confidence she didn't have. She was just wearing a color that wasn't dark. And she had done her hair the way she only did it when she wasn't rushing, and the result was a version of herself she didn't always let people see. Desmond had stood up when she arrived. That small thing, that standing, had made her relax more than any amount of pleasant small talk. They were on their 2nd glass of wine when it happened. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, which was the part that mattered later, the part she'd keep coming back to. She wasn't performing enjoyment. She was just actually having a reasonable time with a reasonable person in an unreasonably expensive restaurant. Desmond had said something about his rookie hockey players and the puck, and the word catastrophic had been used, and she was laughing, and she reached for her wine glass, and she looked up, and across the restaurant, 3 tables away, in the corner where the lighting was fractionally darker and the sight lines to the door were unobstructed, Silvano Marte was sitting very still, looking directly at her. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. She recognized Tomas, not Tomas from the file, a different one. Her brain corrected absurdly. His head of security at the adjacent table. 2 others she didn't know by name but recognized by posture, and across from him at his actual table, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he was in the middle of trying to say something important and was being entirely, pointedly ignored. Because Silvano Marte was not looking at the man in the expensive suit. He was looking at Alara. She had been in difficult situations before. She had sat across from CRA auditors with 90 pages of flagged documentation and kept her face perfectly composed. She had once delivered news to Marte himself that one of his most trusted managers had been siphoning funds for 18 months, and she had done it in a flat, professional voice without flinching. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Desmond and said, "Sorry, you were saying about the puck." And she did not look at that corner of the restaurant again for the rest of the meal. But she felt it, the weight of it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She felt it when their waiter appeared with a bottle of wine she absolutely had not ordered, and bent low to murmur, "Compliments of a guest, mademoiselle." And she did not ask which guest because she knew. She felt it when, 20 minutes later, the man in the expensive suit across from Marte stood up abruptly, said something short and clearly unhappy, and left, which meant that whatever conversation Marte had been having, Whatever deal, whatever arrangement, whatever meeting had brought him to Rivière Noire on a Thursday night, he had ended it. Mid-sentence, by the look of it. Desmond didn't notice any of this. Desmond was telling her about Biscotti's extremely complicated feelings about the vacuum cleaner, and he was funny about it, and she laughed again. And she kept her shoulders loose and her voice easy, and she was absolutely counting the minutes. She excused herself to use the restroom. The hallway to the restrooms at Rivière Noire was narrow and dark-paneled and ran along the back of the restaurant, which meant that to reach it from their table, she had to pass within 4 meters of Silvano Marti's table. She did it without looking. She had excellent peripheral vision and 4 years of practice. She was washing her hands when the door opened. It was not another woman. It was Tomas, who held the door, and said, in the careful way of a man delivering a message he'd been told to deliver exactly as given, "Mr. Marte would like a word." Elara dried her hands very slowly. "Tell Mr. Marte," she said, "that I'm having dinner." There was a pause. Tomas had the expression of a man who had been given contingency instructions and was now deploying them. "He said to tell you it's a professional matter, then he can leave a message with the office." Another pause. Longer this time. "He's going to come in here himself if I go back alone," Tomas said, and this was, she was fairly sure, not part of the official script. This was Tomas editorializing, and there was something almost apologetic about it. Elara looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her had good posture and a green dress and 2 glasses of wine in her, and absolutely did not look like someone who was about to be managed. She straightened her earring. She said, "Then tell him he's welcome to, and that I'll be reporting a hostile work environment to the relevant authorities." She smiled at her reflection. "Also, tell him the Beaumont file updates are on his desk and the numbers he wanted from the Vaudreuil property are in column G." She heard Tomas make a sound outside the door that she was almost certain was a suppressed laugh. She went back to the table. Desmond had ordered dessert menus. She looked at them and thought about the sea salt caramels in her desk drawer, and ordered the profiteroles without apologizing. And Desmond looked delighted by this in a way that was entirely genuine, and they ate their dessert and she kept waiting. Marte appeared at their table at 9:47. She knew this, because she had been watching the time. He stood at the edge of the table with the particular stillness of a man who had never once in his adult life had to announce himself to anyone. He was in a charcoal suit with no tie, which meant he'd either come from something informal or had removed the tie in the last half hour, and his eyes moved from Desmond to Elara with the same quality of attention he gave to spreadsheets, thorough, unhurried, evaluating. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice in the restaurant was the same as his voice in the office. Low, even, the kind of voice that didn't need to get louder to fill a room. Elara set down her dessert fork. "Mr. Marte, I apologize for the interruption." He didn't sound particularly apologetic. "There's an issue with the Tremblant file that requires your attention tonight." There was no issue with the Tremblant file. She had closed the Tremblant file herself on Tuesday, and it was pristine. Desmond had gone very still across the table, in the way that men went still when they realized they were suddenly in a situation they hadn't been briefed on. He was looking at Marte with an expression that was trying very hard to be polite, and was mostly succeeding. "Mr. Marte," Elara said, with the same even tone she used in every meeting, every audit, every document review. "I'll address any file issues during business hours. My number is—" "I know your number," Marte said. The table went very quiet. Desmond coughed. "Sorry, are you her boss?" Marte looked at Desmond. It was a very brief look, precise and complete, the kind that catalogued a person entirely in 3 seconds and filed them accordingly. "I am," he said. "Right." Desmond was a lawyer, and lawyers, Elara knew, had a professional obligation to stand their ground under pressure. She could see him doing exactly that. "And is this an actual emergency? Because Elara's told me she has a tendency to get pulled into work on her off hours, and I'd hate for that to be. Ilara, Marty said, and it was the second time he'd ever used her first name, and he'd chosen to do it here, in a restaurant, in front of a stranger, which meant something she was not going to decode tonight if she could possibly help it. The Tremblant file. She picked up her dessert fork again. The Tremblant file, she said, was completed and submitted on Tuesday at 4:15, column D, rows 12 through 41. If there's been a change since then, it would require a new assessment, which takes 3 business days minimum, which means it cannot possibly require my attention tonight. She took a bite of profiterole. I'll be in at 8:30. The silence was approximately 7 seconds long. Desmond, bless him, reached for his own spoon. Mate stood at the edge of the table for another moment. Something moved in his face. Not much, just a fractional tightening along the jaw, a single pass of something that might, in a different light, have been called frustration, or something else entirely. Enjoy your evening, Miss Voss, he said. He walked back to his table. He did not look at her again. Within 4 minutes, he had settled his bill and left with his security detail, and the restaurant exhaled in his absence the way rooms always did. Desmond set his spoon down and said, very carefully, "Is he always like that?" "Yes," Ilara said. "And you just do that to him? Regularly? Do what? Tell him no." She thought about it. "I tell him what's accurate," she said. "Whether he likes it is his concern." Desmond looked at her for a long moment. "Pitra didn't tell me you were terrifying. Pitra wouldn't use that word. What word would she use?" Ilara finished the last profiterole. "She'd say I know what I'm worth." She went home at 11. She changed out of the green dress. She made chamomile tea and sat by the window that looked out over the street. And she told herself, very firmly, that the evening had been perfectly fine and that she was not going to spend any time thinking about the expression on Silvano Marte's face when she had taken that second bite of dessert. She thought about it for 2 hours. She was at her desk at 8:23 the following morning, because she was constitutionally incapable of being late, even when she'd barely slept, and she was on her 3rd line of the Beaumont reconciliation, when the door to Marte's office opened, and he appeared in the doorway. He looked exactly as he always looked, composed, controlled, the absolute master of every room he entered. He looked at her for a moment. She continued typing. "The Tremblant file was fine," he said. "I know," she said. Another pause. "You knew last night." "Yes, and you knew I knew that." She looked up. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Marte?" He didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the doorframe in a way she had never seen him lean against anything, which is to say, with the posture of a man who was not entirely sure what he was doing in a doorway and was trying to decide. "Who is he?" Marte said, and it wasn't a question, quite. Ilara set down her pen. "I'm sorry. The man at the restaurant." She considered very briefly, saying that it was none of his business, which it absolutely wasn't. She considered saying that she didn't discuss her personal life at work, which was accurate and would have been entirely legitimate. She considered a number of things. What she said was, "Someone Petra introduced me to. He coaches youth hockey. He has a dog." Marte absorbed this. "Is it serious? We had one dinner. Are you going to have another?" Ilara stood up from her desk, because she found that this particular conversation required her to not be sitting down. She was not especially tall. She was aware of the ways in which her body occupied space, the ways in which rooms sometimes resized themselves around her without her asking them to. She was aware of all of that, the same way she was always aware of everything, the same way she'd been aware of Marte's eyes in the restaurant and the wine she hadn't ordered and the meeting he'd ended to sit alone in a corner, watching her eat dessert. "Mr. Marte," she said, "I want to be very clear about something." He waited. "I am exceptional at my job. I have protected this company through 2 audits, 1 restructuring, and a number of other situations that I have been tactful enough not to put on paper. I do that because I am a professional, and because I take pride in what I do." She paused. "I do not do it because I owe you my evenings." His jaw tightened. "I am also allowed," she continued, her voice the same calm, clear register it always was, "to wear a green dress, to go to expensive restaurants, to eat profiteroles without accounting for anyone's opinion, and to have dinner with whoever I would like, without it becoming a professional matter that requires your attention at 9:45 on a Thursday night." She picked up her pen. "If there's nothing else, I have the Beaumont reconciliation to finish." The silence stretched for long enough that she had to keep herself from looking up to see what it meant. "You looked," Marte started. He stopped. She waited. Something in her chest had gone very quiet, the way things went quiet in the seconds, before an important number, resolved on a spreadsheet, that held breath stillness. "You looked like someone I didn't recognize," he said finally. His voice was different. Not the office voice, not the boardroom voice, but something underneath those, something that was probably the original version. "You looked like someone who had no interest in making herself smaller." She looked up then. He was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved, and the look on his face was not what she'd expected, not what she'd catalogued and prepared responses for. It was unguarded in a way that sat very wrong on a man who was always, in every room, the one most carefully guarded of all. "I've never made myself smaller for you," she said. "I know," he said. "I know that. I just didn't." He paused again, and this time it wasn't the pause of a man choosing his words strategically. It was the pause of a man who was finding the words difficult. "I didn't let myself look. Before." The Beaumont reconciliation was open on her screen. Column D rows, 12 through 63. She knew every number in it. She thought about the green dress hanging in her closet. She thought about the sea salt caramels in the left drawer. She thought about 4 years of early mornings and careful distances, and the very deliberate, very considered project of making herself someone who did not need to be seen by anyone she couldn't afford to be seen by. She thought about 2 seconds of eye contact across a restaurant, and the wine she hadn't ordered, and the meeting he'd ended. "I'm going to finish the Beaumont file," she said, "and then I need to talk to you about the Vaudreuil projection in column G, because there's a variance in the 3rd quarter that I flagged. And I want to walk you through my reasoning before you present it on Monday. Elara, the variance is approximately 82,000. So it's material, and I want you to understand the source of it before. Elara." She stopped. He pushed off the doorframe and walked to her desk, and stopped on the other side of it. Not behind it, not beside her, just across from her, the way they'd sat across from each other at every conference table for 4 years. Close enough that she could see the line where the morning light caught the grey at his temples. Close enough that the careful distance she had maintained for 4 years felt, suddenly, like something she'd built out of the wrong materials. "Let me take you to dinner," he said. Not a question. It almost was. It was the closest thing to a question she thought he knew how to ask. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who ran the kind of company that appeared correctly on every tax form, who had ended a meeting to sit alone watching her laugh at a table across a restaurant, who had said her name, twice, in places that weren't offices, and both times it had sounded like something he'd been holding back. "Not Rivière Noire," she said. Something happened in his face. It was very small and very fast, and she almost missed it, but she'd spent 4 years reading the expressions of a man who didn't let himself have them, so she caught it. It was relief, plain and unperformed, and entirely genuine. "Wherever you'd like," he said. "I'm going to finish this file first. I know, and I want to talk through the Vaudreuil variance before the end of the day." "All right." "And," she said and looked back at her screen, "the column G issue is more complicated than it looks, so clear your 3 o'clock. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but something in the neighborhood of one. "Column G," he said. "Right." He went back to his office. She finished the Beaumont reconciliation. She ate exactly 2 sea salt caramels at 3 o'clock, and then she walked to his office door, knocked once, and spread the Vaudreuil projections across his desk. And they spent 90 minutes going through every number, and she explained the variance slowly and clearly, and watched him track it line by line, and at no point did either of them mention dinner again. But when she gathered her papers and turned to leave, he said, "There's a place on Rue Saint-Denis. They do a tasting menu. The lighting is better than Rivière Noire." She considered this. "Does it have profiteroles?" He reached for his phone. "I'll make sure." She went back to her desk. She closed the Vaudreuil file and opened the next one, and outside the window of the office on Boulevard de Maisonneuve, Montreal was doing what Montreal always did in the early autumn, going gold at the edges, letting the light come in low and long, making everything look slightly more like something worth keeping. She did not let herself smile until she was back at her own desk, where no one could see it. But she smiled.